Hi, I'm Stacy again, and I am a crisis response chaplain working in the nonprofit and humanitarian sector with workers all around the globe. And I want to share a little bit today with you about moral injuries. So bear with me here as I get my slides up, and we're going to go to our main screen here. So today I want to talk about moral injury. What is it? And not only what is it, but how do we mitigate the risk of moral injury in our workers? In the second video that I'm going to have, I will talk more about when you do think someone is suffering from moral injury, how do you help that person? So let's get started. So first of all, we've all experienced episodes of moral dissonance or even moral dilemma. Dissonance happens when our internal sense of right and wrong are conflicted. Moral dilemmas force people to choose or act against one moral good in favor of something else. So moral dissonance and even moral dilemmas, not necessarily bad. We face them daily. So it can be frustrating, kind of limiting. One thing that may happen, and we see this quite a bit, is they lead to misunderstandings and distancing on teams and in relationships, as people may not understand one another, the decisions people make. They don't understand those internal struggles people are having, but really it's all just part of the normal fabric of life and living in a diverse world. Not necessarily bad. So here's a current example that maybe if you work in the realm that I work in, maybe you're familiar. So you have a worker and their family. They may live and serve in a developing nation where there's a disparity, a socioeconomic gap. They don't live extravagantly, but their standard of living far exceeds the local people. So you can see the picture above. So maybe your worker lives in that apartment building, but the people they serve live in the houses there in the bottom picture. So you see the disparity in the standard of living. So on a day-to-day basis, that worker feels a sense of moral dissonance and stress at the injustice, the inequity around them, where people go, maybe even without basic necessities. This feeling is going to be heightened in times of greater disparity when resources are stretched thin. So then a moral dilemma occurs when, in the event, so let's say a global pandemic, like what's happening, we're seeing right now in the world, a pandemic happens. The workers are forced to choose to either stay in the community, knowing that their own ability to receive goods and services and supplies may be severely limited, or they leave and they return to their home country where they have plenty of access to supplies and adequate medical care for themselves and their family. So in this case, the decision, stay, assist in the community, or leave for their personal safety. It could be, what if the worker is a medical person with skills, life-saving skills to offer? If they stay in the community, they might be able to save lives there. But they are also risking their family and their own well-being. Perhaps, as in the case now, there's an epidemic that's global, and it could be that their home country needs their skills as well. What if they're not even allowed to make the decision themselves? What if their organization makes it for them? What if they made an initial decision and then lockdown happened, and now they have more data? They have more data about how their country of service is going to handle the situation or the crisis. They have more information now about how they personally or their family members handle the situation. Got more information. So either way, it could be that they're not, maybe flights are canceled. They're not able to leave the country after a certain point. Again, all these things create this moral tension, moral dissonance. There's a dilemma, choices have to be made. It's just a really difficult situation. So if properly attended to and cared for, these types of soul bruises aren't particularly, long-term injurious, but they could be if left unattended. These things are things that could deeply wound someone and create a great deal of shame and blame and guilt. So, what is moral injury? This term was first coined with military veterans. It's commonly referred to as a wound of the soul. Moral injury happens when our deeply held beliefs and expectations about what is right and good are transgressed, resulting in harm. Moral injury is not a mental illness, but it can contribute to mental health issues, and it can coexist with other issues, and it definitely can coexist with mental health issues like trauma. Um, when we identify moral injury, it's important not to focus on judging the person's actions or their failure to act as either right or wrong. So, the importance in identifying moral injury is not judgment or placing blame or deciding what was the best course of action. Really, the important thing is recognizing the impact that the event has had on that person. So, how does injury happen? How does this moral injury happen? It could be that someone is forced to act in a way or to submit to something that they believe is wrong. It could be that they are actually prevented from doing what they consider to be the right thing. It could be they're in a situation where there seems to be no good option to prevent harm. And an example of this would be a doctor forced to choose who would live or die in a certain situation if resources were limited. Um, it could be that someone witnesses someone else doing wrong and they are unable to prevent it or to speak out. It could be because of a power differential. It could be, physically they're not able to, or policy, all these different things. It could be that when someone discovers that the group they belong to, the organization they serve, that they thought was doing good, they come to believe that that organization is doing harm. And that could be perceived, or it could be they actually are. So, a medical worker who believes the policies in their hospital are failing people and are actually causing harm, that and they continue to work there. So that could be a morally injurious situation for that person. Or commonly, this happens that a person feels to blame. They blame themselves because others were harmed or dying. And this is very common also in healthcare workers who may feel personally responsible in situations where they second guess what decisions they made. And finally, something called survivor's guilt. It happens when someone survives a particularly traumatic event and others do not, and they may feel guilty for living or even question their own worthiness to live. So, all these things can be a source of moral injury. At the same time, keep in mind there are degrees of woundedness. One person may experience the very same situation and be spiritually bruised, but another person could be deeply impacted by the same situation. So, in preparing for the reality of moral injury, part of reducing the risk of moral injury is preparing those who are exposed to morally injurious situations and doing that with frank and honest assessments of the situation that they're facing. It's really important to tell the truth about what people will face, especially if it's something that's already known ahead of time, some of the difficulties. Telling the truth about it. Don't avoid the reality of it. Don't minimize the impact it might have on someone. Also, naming it, naming this as an injury. And there's a reason that it's called injury, a reason it's called a wound, because it needs care. But it is something that people can recover from and be healed. The other thing is framing the support with words of solidarity. So letting people know that they're working as part of a team, as part of a community. They're not alone, and they're not alone in their decision making. They're not alone in their concerns. And so that also, part of that is just giving them language for what they're experiencing. and a context for it. And also, when you, to go back to the naming part, when you name something, the added benefit of that is it not only sets boundaries on it, it's instead of then being this nebulous thing that they feel but they don't know what it is, or people really do wonder what's wrong with me. But to give it a name, and it gives boundaries, and it also honors the reality of the experience that people have. And when we frame it in a setting of community, that really lifts the stigma and the isolation that's so often attached to moral injury, because moral injury, the two elements that commonly stand out are guilt and shame. And so when you help ground people in community and that support, then that lifts that feeling of stigma, that feeling of isolation that they have. And finally, so important as preparation, and then we're going to talk about this later in the next video about a safe place and making these safe spaces available to people, creating forums for people like in a small team setting or one-on-one setting, but creating that space for people to talk about what they're feeling, and also ask for help when they need it. So these are the things that we want to do to help mitigate the long-term damage or impact from moral injury. And stay tuned for the second video. And in that video, we will talk about what to do. So